Welcome, everyone. So for our SLN webinar on illegal hunting and wildlife conservation. So we're excited to discuss this pressing issue, especially related to large herbivores, especially mountain ungulates. So illegal hunting and illegal wildlife trade remains one of the biggest threats to wildlife worldwide. And unfortunately, it's really hard to monitor related to its elusive nature and collecting accurate data related to this challenge. So we're excited to learn more from Arash to share how his work is helping address collecting accurate data about this threat, but also informing adaptive management. So he's joining us from Berlin. And then we also have Munib, who's joining us from Kashmir, India, who will share some thoughts on how the data is relevant for some of where he's been working with mountain ungulates. So thank you both for joining us for this webinar. And I just wanted to remind everyone here that we are live on YouTube, SLN's YouTube. But if this is an issue, please write to us, to Reki. And we can always remove, your section when we put this up on our SLN YouTube channel later. And if you have any questions during Arash's talk, please write it in the chat. Right after the talk, we're going to go to Munib and ask him for a few thoughts. But then after the discussion with Munib, we'll come to the questions and discussion, and we hope it's a lively discussion, and we're looking forward to your questions. So without any ado, I'm going to pass it on to Arash. Please go ahead.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me, SLN, and good to be among you all. Lots of you I know from the past, and great to also meet many of you here and hopefully in the future. I'm going to talk about basically the use of ranger-based monitoring data, and more specifically the analog form of it. So basically written logbooks of monitoring and how this can help us to predict poaching, and also how this can help conservation of ungulates, mountain ungulates, something that is hopefully relevant to snow leopard landscape and also its prey, because as you will see, this is in a landscape rather similar to what is relevant to snow leopards. My work was for sure not done alone, and at least one of the co-authors, I'm happy that he's here, Igor is here, but there was a big team of researchers who helped in this work being done, most specifically Corina, who did a lot of the digitization of the logbooks. So I acknowledge and appreciate their work. So yeah, going forward with the topic of poaching, as you probably in many of the circumstances that you are familiar with, poaching is one of the major issues with the faunation. So basically the loss of biodiversity. And this is not only something restricted to certain parts of the world or global south or something like that. This is actually happening in different forms in various parts of the world. And it has been a major issue to tackle in conservation, but so far little has been done to basically understand how poaching occurs and how it can be mitigated. And that's why it is a global conservation priority. And there are different efforts from the very early on of conservation work in protected areas, national parks, trying to limit poaching, but still almost always poachers are one step ahead in different ways. And when the incentives are high, basically poaching is usually happening. And there are major questions on where poaching happens and what determines poaching. These are things that are still to very great extent not well understood. These are really fundamental questions, but I tell in a few seconds why these are not easy to answer. And the core, basically, part of this research is trying to answer these two questions. What is the issue with poaching is that it is cryptic, and also illegal. So it's always kind of a cat and mouse game that there is always like poachers knowing their ways how to basically evade law enforcement, and detecting them is always a very challenging task for the, for example, rangers in a national park or other forms of conservation activities. And another major issue is basically that detecting poaching is a function of search effort. This means that basically if, for example, rangers don't do any patrol, there is no poaching detection. But if there is also, for example, doing a lot of patrolling effort and there is poaching, then it will be detected. But if there is in reality and there is low level of poaching, you also with lots of patrolling, you won't get so many poaching detections. So it is the mere basically comparison of how many poaching detections we have per year cannot give us a clear idea that how much of a problem poaching is in a certain area. It has always to be in relation to the search effort that has been done to know that, okay, given the kilometer distances covered, this many poaching detections we have. And that's why it is also not very trivial, basically, to say that, okay, we have a good understanding of where and how much poaching trend is in different circumstances. So it always needs some level of patrolling effort, which until recently, this was not easy. And now with basically the GPS technology, things are much easier in terms of recording the patrolling effort. But until recently, this was quite difficult. So these are two of the challenges I wanted to talk about. And the third one is also a quite common thing in most protected areas and area-based conservation measures generally around the world, that the amount of data collected, whether digitally or in analog in logbooks, they are rarely being analyzed, and they are rarely being used in adaptive management to basically try to understand where poaching was highest last year and how we can reduce it there and adapt our basically conservation responses to different threat levels that is occurring in a protected area, for example. And this is mainly because of lack of capacity in analyzing the data, but also not having kind of straightforward workflows of how to analyze this data has also hampered what we can learn from this amount of data that sometimes it's daily basically observations of wildlife or sightings of poacher signs or any other illegal activities. So we try to also address this in this study and try to come up with a simple workflow that we can basically better implement these kinds of like inferences from a ranger-based monitoring data. So having said all these challenges, it's also good to know a few basically theories and hypotheses that could help us in better tackling these issues. And one of them is something that I think is yet not so much developed in conservation science, and that is environmental criminology. So and I am not saying that I'm an expert in this, and I know there are several labs and researchers working on this, but generally in conservation, we can much better benefit from knowing where rule breaking behavior is happening and how this could be addressed. And by addressing, I'm also not talking necessarily law enforcement. This could be education. This could be basically alternative livelihoods and things like that, or conflict resolution measures. But generally, it is something that is not so much developed in conservation. And in this study, we try to look into one hypothesis from all the basically knowledge that is out there in criminology, and that is the flag hypothesis. And this is kind of coming from a very kind of fundamental concepts in law enforcement, and that is that there is higher crime in areas with attractive characteristics. So in certain areas, there are more likelihood of basically having non-compliance, and directing your law enforcement or any other measures in that areas could lead into reducing the rule breaking behavior. And in the context of conservation, it can be like, for example, just hypothetically, ungulates are roaming around water springs during the dry season, and that is where poachers also target their animals. And that's why policing these areas, doing patrols in these areas, could lead to lower non-compliance. Another theory that we try to use in this study is based on something probably more familiar to conservationists, and that is a predator-prey relationship. And we try to see if we consider poachers as predators and prey as the mountain ungulates, how we can bring up ecology concepts like availability of prey or how catchable the prey is, and to see whether we can understand how poachers are behaving in terms of identifying their poaching hotspots. So given this background, just to reiterate the goal of the study, which is basically to use of analog logbook data in an adaptive management framework, and with the objectives of mapping the poaching pressure, something that has been rarely done so far, and also trying to explain what are the drivers of poaching. Is it accessibility of the landscape? For example, poachers want to go to areas that are closer to their villages. Or is it avoiding law enforcement, for example, not going to areas near to the ranger stations? Or is it prey availability, so areas that there are actually target species? And this, by trying to disentangle all of this, we don't try to say that there is one size fit all kind of definition to poaching in different contexts. It's actually very context specific, but try to see at least with this workflow, what would be the case here. And I'm sure like even with the same species in different contexts, we might have other drivers identified. So just to make it clear that things might be very different from what I show here compared to, for example, the study site that you are familiar with. So for our case, we worked in Golestan National Park, the oldest national park of Iran in the northeast. It's a unique national park because it is somewhere in between Hirkania forest, so a deciduous forest, and mountain steppe, and also some like arid plains. So like three different ecosystems come together in this park that is around 90,000 hectares. And yes, and there is also, because of the same, because of this diversity, you have 6 ungulate species there that we looked at: bezoar goat, red deer, roe deer, urial, and there is also goitered gazelle and wild boar. So all of these, apart from wild boar, are target to poachers, and the population of several of them has declined in the past 40 years. So bezoar goat, red deer, and urial have declined over the past 40 years, between 60 to 89%. In a different study, we looked at that. But wild boar population in the same time has increased because it is not target to poaching because of their religious beliefs. In the recent years and after what we did, I mean, our study, fortunately, the situation has improved and poaching is to some level controlled. So the populations are recovering in the recent years, and these numbers of decline probably are now a bit smaller. So what we did, we looked at basically to start with, looked at the logbooks. You see the picture to the bottom right. This is how basically 2 pages of this logbooks look like, and they are at least one in each ranger station that you can see in all the maps that I show. And rangers per day, they have to basically note down who is present, how was the weather, which date it is, and which basically route they took and what they saw. It is including wildlife and non-compliance, basically signs, and any other comment. So, and not necessarily every day they have patrols. There are days that, for example, due to bad weather, probably they just say that they couldn't do so, but almost for every day there is an entry. And this is very descriptive. On the right, you can see that top left, you see that basically there is a box, and there they write a few landmarks that usually they note down to say that which route they took, but this is very descriptive and not digitized. So in the first step, we basically extracted all these names from these logbooks, and this is a lot of the work done by Corina Bancaisele, who did so, and digitized all of these locations on the map that is on the left. When we had this, then digitizing basically the rest of the logbooks based on this is very, or at least more straightforward. So it when you know that this name corresponds to this specific grid cell that you can see on the map. So we took all these books between the year 2014 and 2016, and we digitized 4,800 ranger patrols that were originating from at least 8 of these ranger stations. So it was a huge work, but basically once the system was there in terms of having a systematic grid system, the name of the landmarks, and basically also a workflow of digitizing the entries, then it was kind of working without any issues. One major issue that poaching has, as I mentioned in the second slide, is that poaching is is function of the search effort, and detection probability is very important issue. And that's why using methods to analyze poaching information that include detection probability is very important. So we use occupancy modeling here, and 6 covariates that describe distribution of poaching, and 2 that described what affects detection probability under 3 scenarios of prey, law enforcement, and accessibility. And then we also having poaching prediction and patrol levels. So we knew how much each cell was being basically patrolled every year. Then we could say that what are the conditions of these cells? So do we have high predicted poaching and high patrol? Then probably in these areas we need to improve the patrol quality. I'm going to talk about it in the next couple of minutes. And then if we have high poaching pressure but low patrolling intensity, then we need to actually have more patrol there. And the 2 other scenarios are, if you have low poaching but high patrolling effort, then probably these areas are being over patrolled, and maybe you can move some of the patrols from these cells to the areas in the scenario 2. And finally, if you have low poaching pressure and low patrol, business as usual can be continued there. Just to give you an idea, and we don't go to the detail of what we used in the modeling. So we had the site covariance on the top. So prey availability, which was coming from the ranger patrol data, and also accessibility, which was ruggedness of the landscape and distance from park borders and the road that goes through the national park. And for law enforcement scenario, we had the patrolling intensity and distance from ranger stations. For detection probability variables, we had patrolling intensity. So if a cell is being patrolled more often, you probably also detect poaching much easier. And the other one was ruggedness and forest cover. So poachers are more difficult to detect in rugged landscapes or forested landscapes. So these are also on the right column. You can see the hypothesis that we had on the effects of these variables on the poaching prediction. So these are now coming up with some of the basically outputs of the digitization of these ranger patrols and logbook data. And this also shows that not only predicting poaching, but also many other outputs you can get for basically better understanding the distribution and distribution of the species that are living there. So we got 7,600 or so detections of these 4 ungulate species. We also did a measurement of how much basically in a subset of all the patrols, so not all of them, but in 1,000 patrols that we randomly selected, we found out that basically the patrol normally takes around 10 kilometers in distance. There are extreme cases and also lower ones. And this is a mixture of horseback patrols and foot patrols. We identified also 38 poacher detections in 2 years, which is not a big number, but still it's remarkable and enough to allow for basically doing the modeling that we wanted to do. And yeah, as I mentioned, this is the distance covered. Also, very interesting insights into the spatiotemporal variations of patrolling effort across the 96 cells that you saw on the maps before. So basically, we could see that the majority of the cells were being patrolled, and this was basically, and over 2 years, actually, all of them were visited at least once, but some of them were like something around 40 times being patrolled over these 2 years. Also, 2 peaks we were seeing. One was in the month of May, and one which is corresponding to the basically lambing season of ungulates. So there is more poaching because the young lambs are sometimes being taken, and there is more patrolling in response to that. And also in August and September, which is the rut season of red deer, and also a lot of poaching is happening during that time, and in response to that, higher patrolling effort. And lowest was the patrolling effort in the winter months. Just to depict how the encounters with the ungulates would look like. So this was basically this is an indicator kind of borrowed from fisheries actually, but being used in ecology, and that is called catch per unit effort, just trying to basically normalize how much detections you have compared to the patrolling effort. And you can see that in the eastern part of the national park, we had the highest encounters, highest CPUE of ungulates, and this is mostly driven by higher number of urial detections. And we also were able to do occupancy modeling with this data. And you can see in the maps, you can only just see the basically the raw detection numbers, and please mind that the scales are different, and you can see also how different is the sightings of different species. Some are in the hundreds and some are in the thousands. But just to show you that occupancy modeling is also possible in these, with this data set for bezoar goat ruggedness had a positive impact, and the farther distance from ranger station was having a negative impact. Red deer was more confined to the forested region in the west, same as roe deer, but actually Ural was more confined to the east of the national park, where it is a steppe landscape, and that's why a negative relationship with greenness was observed. So finally, I'm showing also the predicted poaching that we were expecting as the main outcome of this study, and you can see that it is highly dependent on the availability of prey. So especially Ural was the main determinant of poaching pressure. So hunters were concentrated in areas with the higher Ural concentration. And also we figured out with the detection probability of our models that there is a very low detection probability of only around 12%. So as mentioned earlier, detecting poaching despite all this effort and patrols is very difficult. Coming back to what I explained about what are the patrolling strategies for the future. So we had the poaching intensity, as you saw in the previous map, and also the patrolling intensity. And when compared, and those four scenarios that I mentioned earlier, you can see on this map that where we need higher patrolling quality or higher patrolling intensity or lower patrolling intensity. So basically, this can provide the park managers on a roadmap on where they can focus on their efforts and do the distribution of the patrols in an adaptive way. Also, worryingly, and during those years that we were working between 2014 and 16, high poaching pressure was detected and predicted in 39% of the park, which is showing that this was a topical issue. And also we, despite this high poaching pressure, we were seeing lots of these cells that have basically need change in their patrolling strategy in the future. As you can see, the blue and red cells are quite widespread in the park. Going a bit deeper into these results. So for those cells that patrolling quantity should be improved, basically these are like around 12% of the area of the park. And this can be supplied with areas with excess patrol. So that is around 20% of the park. This seems to be, at least on paper, straightforward. But the issue is where we need higher patrolling quality, and that is 39% of the park. And for that, we talked with rangers, park managers, even local poachers, that we understood that basically this is usually due to lack of patrolling in, for example, early hours of the day or late hours of the day. And that's why, because rangers usually return to their stations during this time, and this is exactly when poachers use this kind of like darkness of the day to do the hunt and basically disappear in the darkness, and rangers usually couldn't find them. And closing this temporal gap, so being present a bit further into the dark hours, could help in better detection of poaching, despite the difficulties that anyway it has. And also from the results of previous studies in different parts of the world, benefiting from informant networks. So having better relationship with the local people who may report basically occurrence of poaching. This has showed that is leading up to having further success in detecting poachers, as like a comparison to basically patrolling without any cues from where the poachers might be. So that's another suggestion on how to increase the quality. And looking at the environmental criminology hypothesis that we saw, it seems like the poachers are targeting areas with highest available prey, and that is urea. And this is also the area that when the poachings are usually being, when they are being captured, then you see that more than one individual is usually being hunted. So more than one urial. And this is giving hints towards the fact that there might be a more commercial incentive in basically selling the meat among the local hunters. And we know it from also previous studies that the meat is partly the incentive for poaching is due to tradition and own use, but also a number of the poachers actually sell the meat as a delicacy to people in the cities. And this is probably one of the major basically determinants of poaching in the national park, as we saw. As we showed, and we said it from the beginning, detecting poachers is very challenging, and it has remained challenging. There are new technologies in different parts of the world now trying to use drones and night visions and so on, but still, when there is high incentive for poaching, as it is, for example, with rhino poaching or things like that, there is still, this is not kind of a silver bullet, these kind of technological advances, and still we unfortunately have challenges in detection of poachers. And also showing what we basically benefited from this, like ranger logbooks, the analog ones, shows that actually how even without having GPS units for all the rangers in the park, we can still have robust analysis of this monitoring data that we receive. And with our work, we showed how basically a simple workflow like this could be used in different contexts and different parts of the world, which we hope that this will be the case in areas that the ranger-based monitoring is happening. So just to conclude, and a few take-home messages, wherever there is a ranger-based monitoring, whether it is digital or analog, there is an untapped wealth of data usually that is not being used in most cases, unfortunately. And this is, I think, mostly due to lack of resources, but I think given these kind of rather more straightforward workflows, we should be able to untap this wealth of data and benefit from that for adaptive management and conservation of threatened species. And also, even if we have the digital way of collecting ranger-based monitoring data, and previously we had the analog ones, using this data, we actually can basically expand the assessment to the past and have reached to the baseline of what, for example, the situation was a few decades ago. That's also a new avenue for analysis and better understanding of poaching pressure over time. And also this, as mentioned earlier, could help a lot in strategic conservation planning of protected areas, something that is in many contexts rather static, but we need to be more adaptive to basically changes in the threat levels. Thank you very much. There is a paper published from this work that you can see the title here, and it should be free access. So yeah, please feel free to download it, and I'm happy to have a discussion with Munib and also more talking about your questions. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Arash, for this very fascinating talk, and you were able to look very much in detail for all of that data, which we'd like to. I think we might have a few questions more on the analysis. I see that questions are coming in, but before, so I'd like to encourage everyone to send in your questions in the chat. But as we do that, I'd like to bounce the ball to Munib and ask if, what are your thoughts on this issue? You're very much involved in mountain ungulate monitoring and double observer surveys. So what are your thoughts on, the method of the approach and how it could be used in other areas of the snow leopard range or other areas of Asia?
Sure. No, thanks, Justine, for allowing me to speak. And yeah, thanks, Arash, for sort of taking us through your study. I find it super fascinating. I mean, there's so many threads that I find fascinating in this work because there's different sort of theories, different analysis, different issues being tackled in a sort of a holistic way. So I think there's a lot to be said there. I think one thing that I found super useful is how, to look at some of these untapped resources, data resources, as Arash put it, these analog data booklets that have perhaps been, being collected in many, many areas across snow leopard landscapes and otherwise, as in Golestan National Park. I think there's so much potential to sort of ask ourselves, okay, what other data sources might there be out there that we might be missing? Because I think a lot of times, at least in the areas I work in Trans-Himalayan India, the first thing we say is, oh, we lack data. And that's generally true. But I think it's also equally important to ask ourselves, okay, what data might be there in different forms? And I think for me personally, to make this a bit more tangible, I thought it was very useful because we work in non-protected areas or mostly outside protected areas. Obviously, this case study is from a protected area in Iran. And we've been trying to work with something called local champions. So it's kind of like what Arash said with the local informant people, right? I think poaching in our landscape is prevalent. It's less so than some of the other landscapes. It tends to be for wild ungulates, again, similar to what Arash was speaking. But we have a lot of negative human-wildlife interactions, like snow leopards killing livestock and then people killing snow leopards in return, which sometimes also gets linked to illegal wildlife trade. And I think this sort of work that Arash and team spoke about, when we have information coming from these local champions about these instances, that's the whole idea, to have them as almost like first responders on the ground. I think we can use that data to not only sort of look back at where some of these negative instances have happened, but also sort of predict where they might happen into the future. And I think that's where the map that Arash showed us about sort of how to sort of almost look at patrols again into the future in terms of their quality and quantity. We could do something similar in terms, we don't necessarily have patrols, but we might have these local champions going out and trying to understand where these conflicts are happening, which may feed into poaching. So I thought that was very interesting. And I think that's very translatable from the work Arash and team have done in Iran to some of our landscapes. So that I see. I did wonder, and I wanted to ask Arash, like, how much of the data that gets collected by rangers in your context, how much wriggle room is there to sort of update what data is being collected through insights from the rangers itself? Or is it sort of a template that is given to them that they just go out and collect? I know some of your work is almost trying to inform what they do in terms of spatial and temporal aspects of it. But is there also wriggle room to sort of have a more participatory approach of what data is being collected in and of itself? Because I think that's something we're struggling with, especially with analog data. People write in certain languages change over time, and people are more comfortable writing in I feel some cultures are more comfortable writing more discursively, more descriptively, and others tend to like, columns and rows. So I just wanted to hear a bit of that from your side, if I may.
Yeah, thanks. This is really an important issue. And actually, these logbooks are basically being designed and even printed in the center, in the capital, in Tehran, and being distributed across all these like few hundred protected areas across the country. And I mean, we actually had suggestions on improving them and to basically make the analysis of similar analysis to ours much easier in the future by having, for example, just simple page next to each day patrol with a map and a systematic grid network on top of the map of the protected areas, so that rangers every day try to basically cross down, okay, which cells they basically patrol. But this kind of like changes are quite substantial when it comes, you scale up to the national level. And that's why we have to yet contact basically the people in the central office of Department of Environment to see whether they are happy to do that. And this also makes these logbooks protected area specific, which also has logistic issues in terms of, okay, then you have to design it for each and every protected area. But at least it could be started with, for example, national parks, which are like a few dozens. And yeah, so there could be, but we haven't yet tested the kind of tendency to make adaptations to this kind of data collection. The only issue that we also need to acknowledge, both in the type of data and also whether we have a map, for example, as an annex to the day patrol reporting, is that rangers may or let's say over-report or exaggerate their patrolling if it is not being kind of collected using a GPS. So so this may end up with much higher patrolling effort than the reality. But yeah, these days now on smartphones, you have all the GPS capabilities, and you can try to come up with some ways to basically make sure that these patrols were taken, and you don't just rely on the written format and just like maybe randomly testing some of the patrols whether they were taken or not.
Yeah, super interesting. I see there's lots of questions in the chat, so I'll keep my my thoughts and sort of response to a minimum. Yeah, but like very fascinating. As I said, I think for me the big learning was, you know, to just go beyond poaching as well and sort of look at conflict in general. I think this is a great framework to do that, particularly across larger landscapes, even outside protected areas. I was just thinking about, as I said, you know, we could change rangers to local champions, and that the flow of information, you know, becomes similar but from different areas. So I think that's super interesting. I let the questions sort of go next. I don't know, Justine, did you want to read them out?
Sure.
Or should,
Yeah, Munib, I mean, you can jump in later with the questions if something comes up as well, because I think the next question, for example, draws on what you're talking about, how one can involve local communities in the conservation of recruiting them, such as rangers, instead of someone from outside the community. So this is a question from Bilal. Arash, so maybe you can share about your context, and maybe Munib, then you can also share in your context how that process is going on.
Absolutely. I mean, this is actually, if you remember that at the beginning, I said that there was a big decline in the past few decades in the target ungulate species, between 60 to 90%. But then I mentioned that in the recent years, there is a recovery. And this is mainly due to actually a change in management of the national park. So somebody who has a very good kind of record of managing national parks in Iran came into this position in Golestan, and his style of work is actually involving lots of local people in decision making, in monitoring, and in having a good rapport with the local communities. And since then, while actually also making sure that law enforcement is taking place robustly. So combination of these few aspects actually led to much lower poaching pressure and recovery of the ungulates. So yeah, absolutely. Recruiting locals and also involving them in decision making, at least from the story of Golestan National Park, it made miracles basically in terms of responses of wildlife and the conservation outcomes in general.
Yeah, and very, very briefly from my side, Bilal, I mean, yeah, I think some of the most important information that we get from our landscape, as I said, we work less on poaching. A little bit of our work is to understand poaching, but it's more on negative interactions in general, come really from local, as we call them, local champions. So let me explain that a little bit. It's basically people who show a little bit more of an inclination towards, be it conservation of wildlife or just interest in wildlife. So we try to tap into that a bit more systematically, and that could be in terms of information flows. And there are some incentives aligned with that. Sometimes incentives can be financial itself, where you might be getting a stipend or something to do that work. But often incentives are not financial, where you're sort of living in a more collective society, so you might be benefiting from some of the interventions that might come in from the information that you provide. For instance, these pens to stop predation of livestock from predators. So I think often the incentives are they're not financial in that sense. But I think what's very useful, one useful learning for us has been to really let that information, that bottom-up information, be as participatory and open-ended as possible. I think that doesn't remove bias from it. In fact, I think it adds bias to it. But sometimes it's interesting to see what that bias is, because once we get that data from these local champions, I think we tend to have a lot of discussions, sort of these almost debrief discussions to really understand what that data means. So often, yes, as I said, that data might be a bit biased, but I think those debrief meetings at the end of that really help us understand, okay, what that issue what is the real, we might not be able to quantify it, but what is the relative importance of poaching here, or what is the relative importance of other conflicts here. So I think that has been quite an interesting learning for us. But, yeah.
Yeah, thank you both. So now let's go to Kamalika. She's asking if there's been an increase for you, Arash, if there's been increasing patrolling in the areas that were less patrolled before, and if that has been effective in controlling poaching, because you shared that, it's done over time. So if you've shown changes in poaching pressure related to patrol.
I mean, so this study was only over these 2 years, but based on the results of predicted poaching, there were a few outposts, so few like temporary ranger stations were established, just like small shelters, let's say, in these areas with higher poaching pressure. And this seemed to have actually helped a lot in basically the presence of, even if it is temporary, presence of rangers in these high poaching areas actually led, I can only say it qualitatively, but it seems like looking at the numbers of wildlife recovery in the recent years, it seems like it has worked, but it's good to actually redo the same analysis, for example, with the data from more recent years and see how actually this has changed compared to the 2014-16.
Okay, and then this brings to the next question, Balzame, about the temporal distribution of poaching, Arash. I don't know if you have anything else to add about that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Salma. And ideally, we wanted to do a kind of dynamic occupancy modeling. So try to see if, for example, we have cells that, I mean, now it gets a bit more technical on the modeling part, but basically with dynamic occupancy modeling, trying to say if we had cells that had higher poaching, but then the poaching went down, or vice versa. The problem is that 2 years is not enough for doing dynamic occupancy modeling. And that's why we needed more years, but we haven't had digitized this. The effort of digitizing the logbooks was mainly done by Corina and during her master thesis. So basically this type of data we didn't have for more years, but I can say that there are a few papers using the same approach, but benefiting from digital like GPS collected data and over several years. And they have shown very nicely actually how the distribution of poaching changes over time in their case studies, which are, I think, mostly were from Africa.
Yeah, because now there are a lot of tools like the Smart Connect, right, Arash?
Exactly.
That help you collect this live, that might be able to.
And there's a lot of data. I mean, it's really, this amount of data really needs some workflows to basically being analyzed, because otherwise, actually, maybe I then refer to this misconception sometimes that for many people, it's in the management level of protected areas I encounter that they think that actually something like SMART alone is a way to stop poaching, but actually it's not. I mean, until you don't analyze where poaching is happening, basically, or any non-compliance, it is basically a tool for collecting the data, actually using this data to then basically direct your resources to areas that are higher priority, then you can basically improve the situation.
So I see there's a lot of more questions. Yeah, go ahead, Munib. But go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, sorry to break you. Like, no, I think it's a very fascinating question. Very quickly from my end, also, like, I think it's very interesting how poaching or hunting in general, if I can sort of, I know those are two different things. Like changes in the landscape that I'm currently at, because there's a clear sort of cultural connect with poaching or rather hunting. In winter, where people will go out and sort of in these hunting parties to hunt for musk deer, and they won't necessarily use it for meat. I mean, there is a bit of musk pods going into the market and things like that, and that's a very specifically winter time activity for multiple reasons, both cultural and seasonal. Of course, it's easier to find musk deer in the winter, some people say, but it's also like culturally, winters were the time where there's no agriculture and other things sort of slow down a little bit. So I think, yeah, it's a very interesting sort of link between seasons and sort of temporally shifting time frames and hunting and poaching in some of the areas where we were. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, not just amongst years, but seasonal. Thanks. No, thanks, Munib. So we have a question now from Igor, who's asking if you've translated your paper for the authorities and if they've maybe followed up with your recommendations.
I mean, great point. And I must say that the whole paper we unfortunately didn't translate. We should have done it, but we basically gave the main insights of the paper in terms of the maps of poaching pressure, distribution of wildlife, and our suggested strategies to the park management. But I think this, if we want to make a difference at the higher level, at the institutional level, I think this is something that we definitely should do to basically inform the central Department of Environment to know about the results of this study and how actually other national parks can also perhaps adapt this kind of approaches. But yeah, great point.
And then a follow-up question related to that from Mustafa, asking what rules are proposed for poachers in Iran. So if a poacher is apprehended, what would happen to them? Yeah,
I mean, also important context-dependent things too. Good. I mean, the presentation was short, so I couldn't really explain all of these things. But generally, in Iran, there is the Department of Environment responsible for protected areas and area-based conservation measures, and and there are strict rules about poaching. So ungulates that I mentioned here, some of them are protected species and some are not. So some of them are possible to be hunted legally, but if for any reason it is an illegal hunt, then there are basically fines, heavy fines for poaching. It may even end up with after the court, if the judge decides even to prison time, if it is a repeated crime or something like that. But basically what we discussed also, this is important point to mention, that we talked about the detection part of the whole law enforcement chain. From the time that ranger actually introduce or like captures, so rangers also carry guns in Iran and are basically law enforcement units. Unlike many countries that actually they cannot arrest somebody, in Iran they can. But then from that moment on, what goes on is also a longer chain that not always leads to conviction, for example, and things like that. And these kind of things, of course, are impacting the effectiveness of law enforcement as a whole. So all we talked about is how to detect the poachers, but of course you need a robust kind of chain of law enforcement outside of the protected area as well.
Yeah, very good point. It's not only detecting, it's, you know, what happens after.
Yeah.
And yeah, so now let's go to Kamalika. She's asking, can you share more? And maybe we'll go to Munib and you, Arash, about these more digital systems, because we talked about bias, right? And how there potentially is bias with these logbooks. I don't know if there are other biases that maybe digital systems could address and help improve the data collected from rangers.
So we had an effort, at least, sorry, Munib, I go first. We had efforts to implement this for the first time in Iran some years ago, but then it was interrupted due to complicated situation. And basically, in Iran, we don't have, but I think at least in some of the protected areas that I work with in Georgia, for example, SMART is being used. And there also, I know that I guess within the snow leopard landscape, also there are sites with smart implementation, or not necessarily it has to be even smart. I mean, there are different also other tools that could be used. So at the moment in the national park I mentioned, there is no digital collection of data happening, but of course this will facilitate and speed up the data collection, but at the same time, the volume is very high. So you need to also think about ways of volume of data, so of how to analyze it. So that's also, yeah, an issue to consider, basically.
I mean, a quick one from my experience. This is mostly from Trans-Himalayan India again. We've not really done, you know, sort of the large scale patrolling kind of work with SMART and things like that. But a very quick point on the digital side of things. I mean, we've tried to work with about 100, 150 herders and local champions, as we term them. And we started off with just, you know, analog data entry, and, you know, then that had issues of translation because people were writing in different languages, and, you know, how different words mean and certain things, but just the effort to translate. So then we started looking at more sort of easy to use, directly digital platforms as well, and we found different set of problems there. Some are more user-based problems, connection-based problems, depending on where you are, different levels of, you know, buy-in to use that technology, even if it's simple, depending on who defines what simple is. So I think the sweet spot where we've sort of settled at, and that's working well, is predominantly the data is collected in analog form, in, you know, languages and sort of ways which people find very useful. Then we try to identify one person in that area, because again, we are working predominantly with local communities, who is a little bit more adept and is a little bit more entrepreneurial, who's happy to sort of, you know, have that extra work where he or she or they collect the analog data and digitize it. I know that's a lot of work, but it is not done by us directly. It's done by somebody on the ground, and it's done a bit more periodically. For instance, at one place, we have 6 monthly data coming in. So this person digitizes it every month, ideally. So that's a sort of sweet spot we've really been working with, and that's been effective. So yeah, mix of analog and digital.
The next question is really long, and it's from Julian. I don't know if he's still here, so I'm going to ask him to take the mic and to ask directly. If you're there, Julian, please, and go ahead and maybe ask your questions one by one.
Yeah, hi, sorry.
No, it's great.
Hi, Arash. Nice to
Hi.
see you again after all these years. Thanks for the talk. So, first quick question. I might have missed it, but what's the predominant methods of poaching in that area? Is it snaring, hunting with shooting, something else? Just out of curiosity, really.
It is shooting, yes.
Okay.
So no snaring as far as we know. Very different to, for example, the situation in parts of Africa or Southeast Asia, that snaring is the big thing. Yeah.
Okay, and then thanks. My second question was more related to actually the recommendation from your modeling. When you say that, in terms of, at the end of the day, you want to optimize patrolling and say, okay, well, let's take patrol effort from, in a way, over patrolled cells where there's little poaching, and allocate that effort to areas where poaching is more likely. But my question is that, don't you think there's a risk that then you lose the deterrent effect of patrolling in these low poaching cells if you remove the patrol effort from there? And
absolutely. I mean, this is really good point. And I mean, there are studies again from Africa showing that there is a deterrence effect and there is a decay in deterrence effect. So actually, if you are not showing up in these cells, basically you may end up creating new poaching hotspots. So basically, we didn't go over this in our analysis, but at least I know 1 or 2 studies from Africa that are suggesting to have a baseline, basically patrolling in all of the cells over the years, so that these cells are, at least to a certain extent, being observed in terms of their situation, and then relatively have higher and lower. So this is, I think, what is the general consensus in. So not kind of leave alone some of the cells.
No, obviously not like not zero, but like a minimum kind of patrol pressure. Okay, yeah. And then my third question is unrelated, in fact, but so you say that for cultural reason, wild boar is not poached in that area, and the population has increased. So ecologically, do you have a sense of what's going on with natural predators' impact on the other prey species? Because you could expect something like apparent competition, where wild boar population increasing, it would help predators to flourish, relatively speaking, and then they would prey more on the other species. Have you observed that, or do you have like a gut feel for that phenomenon?
So, I mean, let's say if there are a few steps in all these relationships, so like a few of them, we have some data and some like results about them, but not the last part, that is whether this then has a negative impact on other prey. So we know that, for example, the diet of leopard is over 50% on wild boar. So this is the main carnivore of the large carnivore of the national park, which is rather, compared to other studies, rather unusual, given that in many parts, wild boar is considered as a risky and too large of a prey for leopard. But we also need to take into account larger leopards in this part of the world, in Iran and generally Persian leopards. So this means that basically, at least unlike other subspecies, wild boar in this national park is a major prey for the species, which is most likely due to a lack of the other preferred prey, which is the bezoar goat. And this seems to be across Iran and in different also parts of the Persian leopard distribution as one of the most preferred prey species. But then whether now flourishing Persian leopards in this national park, and we are talking about around 20 to 30 leopards in 90,000 hectares. So it's fairly an okay density. Then if this is also suppressing bezoar goat, is really an interesting study, but I have no answer to it actually. But I think at least it reminds me of one study from Mongolia with basically, I think it was in Ichnart, and it was about wolves poaching, wolves conflict and kind of depredation of livestock and the impact on wild ungulates, which was Argali, which is a nice study. I can share you the link. And it was looking at this kind of three-way interaction and how actually wolves flourishing from availability of livestock suppresses the wild ungulates. By, I don't exactly now remember, but yeah.
Thanks for your answers. Thank you.
No worries.
Thanks.
Stefan Ekernas, now I remember.
And thanks, Julian, for those really interesting questions. And we have another question from Eliza. We have a few more questions, Arash, so please bear with us. We might go a little bit over time, and thanks everyone for staying on. We have a question from Eliza, who's looking at whether there's been a diversification of patrol style, including night patrols, observation posts, extended patrols, to increase poaching detection over time.
I mean, one thing, thanks for the question. Basically, observation post, the outpost that I mentioned, this was being implemented, and it seems to have had a good impact on detecting poaching and reducing and deterring poachers, basically. But also, we need to include, so yes, night patrols, extended patrols, things like that during the recent management has been implemented. But we also need to know a big part, and that is the motivation of the rangers. So without motivated rangers, kind of like still you may have lots of poaching. And one of the successes of the recent management of the park was basically having good relationships with the locals and also with the rangers themselves. So keeping them motivated. And this was, I think, one of the things that we also need to take into account. As you can see, it's a lot of it is ecology, conservation, and so on, but also you can bring in a lot of like human relationships in successful conservation work. Yeah, these things I can mention, but yeah, some of them were implemented from the points that you mentioned.
It would be interesting to monitor those as well, Arash, I don't know, and bring them into your models, because I'm seeing how it would affect it. And I see that, Mushtaba, you're here with us on video, so I don't know if you can ask your question yourself about the theory behind the study.
Yeah, thank you, Arash. That was a very good presentation and very informative and interesting for me, because my research is also very relevant to what you have done. So basically, I'm also doing research on poaching and illegal wildlife trade in Afghanistan. So the theory that you presented, or we can say conceptual framework, which is environmental or conservation criminology, is a very good conceptual framework to study poaching as a criminal activity. And there are a lot of papers that apply this conceptual framework to study poaching and illegal wildlife trade. But my concern about this conceptual framework is because it consists of many theories, like if you can count it as more than 10 or 15 or even more than 15 theories that combine and make the conceptual framework. So when I was watching your presentation, you mainly focusing on the accessibility and law enforcement and pre-availability, which is given more sense to me about the RAT theory, or routine activity theory, which is more discussing on motivated offender, suitable target, as well as capable guardianship in a protected area or somewhere that wildlife is there, and studied focusing on poaching and illegal wildlife trade. I was interested to see if you have specified any specific theory or combined specific theories to answer this question, or you discuss about the deterrence, and I'm not sure how much you benefit from the deterrence theory to suggest the deterrence, and how these deterrence was like from the theory perspective. You're talking like how much this severity, certainty, and celerity of this theory can be applied in your study, and whether you have think about the poaching. I mean the rangers and the ranger work that in the area that you're doing is how severity or the period or frequency and the I can say, and the certainty that the poacher should understand that these area are under patrol of the rangers are impacting the decision of the poachers. Did you focus, or did you touch upon these? And if so, how did you find out the relationship between the rangers and policing, and how these two combination can enhance the guardianship in protected areas?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, lots of important thoughts, and it seems like you are really deep into this topic and know a lot about it, definitely more than me, I think, with all the theories out there. So I must say, like, there were a few, I think, questions and a few things to consider. And one thing that we wanted to basically, so in terms of environmental criminology, this was basically, we were trying to focus on repeated basically offenders. So this is what we were looking at between a flag and boost hypothesis. So basically boost hypothesis is then, in comparison to flag that I mentioned, is basically where poachers are or offenders basically are going to their favorite, let's say, non-compliance spots, as in comparison to areas with certain characteristics that we were considering in this work. And it has been used, especially, I mean, I'm sure you know much more about this, but in fisheries. So like generally marine protected areas and fisheries generally, they are far more advanced when it comes to this kind of analysis than the terrestrial protected areas. So we were borrowing some of the insights from there. But deterrence, so that's one part. You mentioned deterrence. Yes, and as Julian also mentioned, deterrence is a major issue, and it needs to be considered, especially if we have kind of multi-year data. So ours was more of a snapshot of the situation, although we were using 2 years of data, but actually we were kind of considering it as occurring over one snapshot of time. And that's why, for knowing better about the impacts of deterrence, you need larger data sets of like a couple of years, a decade or so, to know how basically this type of like interactions are happening between rule breakers and law enforcement. And yeah, so I think, and also a few other points you mentioned about, for example, the issue of like going beyond these 3 scenarios of accessibility, law enforcement, and prey availability. We had ideas, and again, I'm referring to several studies that they had gone beyond these scenarios, but then they were benefiting also from a much higher density of data in terms of spatial and temporal density. So given our data set, which was basically handwritten logbooks, many questions could not be answered into detail. So this kind of like, for example, 3 by 3 kilometer, or reducing all the patrols to just 1 day, and then also cumulatively making it into a monthly indices, index of patrol per cell. These are all like simplifications that we had to do because of the data that we had. Given like more accurate data that is now in most areas available, much more can be done with this kind of questions.
Thanks, Mushtaba and Arash. I hope you guys also connect, because I see you have another question. He has another question in the chat. So if you guys could connect and maybe continue this conversation, I think it would be really interesting. And there were a number of other small questions, but I'm going to bring us to an end. I think most of the other comments were thanking you both for the really fascinating talk and discussion. And I just want to first go back to both of you and any last thoughts. I mean, one thing maybe people are wondering is, with ungulates, you do detect them, you see where they are, but what about species that are even more elusive, such as large carnivores, snow leopards? Could such techniques also be beneficial? I don't know if you can end with some thoughts related, bring it back to snow leopards, considering, I mean, prey are really important, but also we get very little data on poaching of snow leopards. So any thoughts on that? And then maybe we'll bring it to a close after that. So maybe first to Arash and then to Munib.
Okay. Thanks. This is important, and also good to mention that basically, at least in this national park, we don't, I mean, leopards are not being considered as poaching targets to basically go actively inside the national park to poach a leopard. So the fines are much higher. There is certain cultural values towards leopard, that they admire the species, although conflict also happens. So a leopard killing happens in and around villages in some instances, but generally our models and our poaching kind of detections was directed towards ungulates because they are the target of the poaching. But of course, in areas that you have this as an issue for another, for example, large carnivore, then probably the direct observations from these logbooks won't be so useful, because of course you have less detections of this kind of solitary elusive species, and there probably you can combine data, for example, from camera traps with the patrolling data, and then try to kind of come up with some like using that as a variable in your models, basically. That's from my side. I mean, Munib.
Yeah, very, very quickly, lots of fascinating points. But I'd like to sort of share with everyone very quickly a learning that I got from a colleague who works out actually on tigers. And I think now he's the director for the Panthera program of, the tiger program. And they do a lot of work in Southeast Asia, a little bit in India, but mostly in Southeast Asia. And bulk of their work really is to tackle poaching and illegal hunting through patrols and things like that. And I think he made a very good point, which I thought would be nice to say it here. And I think we need more of that in snow leopard landscapes, is more collaborations with people who have backgrounds in criminology and sort of policing particularly. So I think what we're doing now, which is good, is we're borrowing theory and sort of learnings from these fields and applying them. But I don't know how much or how many of us, at least not my team as of now, how many of us are actively collaborating with people who have criminology or policing backgrounds. I think they come with their with their background, their discipline, so they're very solid in their theory, and that's where I think we can do a lot more, both in terms of research but also application on the ground. And there's some really nice work that these colleagues that I was mentioning that they're doing with tiger poaching, and I think that's really been happening because they have people with these backgrounds working with them. I think that's really something that I want to leave us with in this webinar. Whether we think there is space to actually not just borrow theory from other disciplines, but actually actively collaborate with people from there.
Thank you, Munib and Arash, for sharing and for joining us today. I think that was the longest discussion we've had in a long while, and there were still questions. So thank you so much. And I hope we can continue these discussions maybe online or other events. But what's really interesting is the layers related to this work of illegal wildlife trade and illegal hunting. You're showing that it's not only about detections and patrols, right? It's also about the motivation of the rangers, involving communities within protected areas or outside protected areas, and many other issues and feedback effects of all of this work. So very interesting, and I hope that more of our teams can work on this. And like you said, there's so much data out there of different organizations working on large ungulates and monitoring them with poaching. So I don't know if in the future we can bring this all together and maybe even do a range-wide kind of assessment on this kind of work. That would be really interesting. I don't know if Munib and Arash can take that baton and that work forward. It would be really interesting for SLN and the snow leopard community, or anyone else here involved that would be interested. But I know SLN would be happy to facilitate that kind of coordination. But thank you everyone for coming and asking all these questions and discussions. And please do keep in touch with the authors, and see you on April 24th. We're going to talk about community responsible areas and legal rights of communities in Mongolia for our next presentation. So thanks everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you.